The dying scream pierced through the small cabin like a knife through butter, cutting Matthew Baines to his very core as he paced anxiously outside the bedroom door. Spring of 1878 had brought new life to the dusty landscape of Deming, New Mexico territory. But inside his modest homestead, death was making its cruel presence known. His wife's labor had started 20 hours earlier, and the midwife's increasingly worried glances told him everything words could not. "Push once more, Catherine. I can see the baby's head," the midwife's voice commanded from behind the closed door. Matthew ran his calloused hands through his dark hair, his tall frame rigid with tension. At 32, he had faced down rustlers, survived droughts, and built this ranch from nothing. But nothing had prepared him for this helplessness. The final scream that came was different, primal, desperate, followed by the thin wail of a newborn. Relief flooded through him for only a moment before he heard the midwife's panicked voice. "She's bleeding too much. Mrs. Baines, stay with us." Matthew burst through the door to see his wife, pale as the sheets beneath her, holding their newborn son while blood pooled beneath her. Her auburn hair was plastered to her forehead with sweat, her blue eyes growing dimmer by the second. "Matt," Catherine whispered, her voice barely audible. "Our son, Thomas." Matthew fell to his knees beside the bed, taking her hand. "You'll be fine, Kathy. You'll be fine." But the lie tasted bitter on his tongue. "Take care of him," she murmured, her eyes fixed on the tiny bundle. "And Elizabeth. Tell her I love her." Their 2-year-old daughter was staying with a neighbor, blissfully unaware that her world was crumbling. The midwife worked frantically, but Catherine's eyes slowly closed, her breathing growing shallower until it stopped entirely. Matthew's anguished cry echoed across the ranch, startling the cattle in the distant fields and sending a flock of birds scattering into the clear blue sky. 3 days later, Catherine Baines was laid to rest under an elm tree on their property. Matthew stood stone-faced, holding his newborn son while Elizabeth clutched his leg, too young to understand why her mother wouldn't wake up. The small gathering of neighbors and friends from Deming offered their condolences. But their words washed over Matthew like rain on parched earth, noticed but unable to penetrate the hardened surface of his grief. "If you need anything, Matt, you know where to find us," said Frank Wilson, his closest neighbor, clasping his shoulder. Matthew merely nodded, his eyes fixed on the fresh mound of dirt. How could he possibly raise 2 children alone on a cattle ranch? Catherine had been his North Star, his reason for pushing forward through the hardships of frontier life. Without her, he felt adrift in a sea of responsibility too vast to navigate. That evening, after putting Elizabeth to bed with a story he struggled to finish, Matthew sat on the porch with Thomas in his arms. The baby fussed, hungry and uncomfortable, his tiny face red with frustration. Matthew tried to feed him the goat's milk the midwife had suggested, but the infant refused, his cries growing more desperate. "I don't know what you need," Matthew whispered, his voice breaking. "Your mama would know. God, Kathy, I can't do this without you." As if in response, a soft knock came at the door. Matthew rose wearily, expecting Frank or his wife checking in. Instead, he found Sarah Kendrick standing on his porch, her honey-colored hair pulled back in a practical braid, her green eyes filled with determination and compassion. Sarah had arrived in Deming just 6 months earlier, taking over as the town's schoolteacher after her predecessor married and moved east. At 26, she was unmarried and independent, qualities that had raised eyebrows among some of the more traditional townsfolk. But her kindness and dedication to her students had quickly earned her respect. "Mr. Baines," she said softly, her eyes falling to the crying infant in his arms, "I heard about Catherine. I'm so sorry for your loss." Matthew nodded stiffly, unused to the formality from someone he'd shared Sunday suppers with when Catherine was alive. "Thank you, Miss Kendrick." Sarah hesitated, then squared her shoulders. "I know this might seem forward, but I've come to help. I helped raise my 4 younger siblings after my mother took ill. I know how to care for babies." Matthew's pride, wanted to send her away. What would people think of a single woman helping a newly widowed man? But Thomas's cries were growing more desperate, and Elizabeth had barely eaten since her mother died. "Let me help you raise your children now," Sarah said firmly, not as a question, but a statement of fact. "At least until you find your footing." Something in her steady gaze broke through the wall Matthew had begun building around himself. Without a word, he stepped aside, allowing her to enter the cabin that still held Catherine's presence in every corner. Sarah took the fussing baby with practiced hands. "He's hungry, poor little one. Do you have milk?" "Goat's milk, but he won't take it," Matthew replied, watching as she expertly cradled Thomas. "He needs it warmed, and the nipple might be too big. Let me show you." She moved toward the kitchen with confidence, and for the first time in days, Matthew felt a tiny flicker of hope. That night, Sarah stayed until both children were fed and sleeping peacefully. She showed Matthew how to swaddle Thomas properly, how to burp him, and promised to return the next day with supplies from town. "I can't pay you much," Matthew said gruffly as she prepared to leave. "The ranch barely breaks even these days." Sarah turned, her expression serious. "I'm not asking for payment, Mr. Baines. Catherine was kind to me when I first arrived in Deming. Let me return that kindness." Over the following weeks, Sarah fell into a routine. She would teach at the schoolhouse until 3 o'clock, then ride out to the Baines ranch to help with the children. She taught Matthew how to prepare simple meals, showed him how to soothe Thomas's colic, and brought bright moments of normalcy to Elizabeth, who had grown quiet and withdrawn after her mother's death. Matthew watched Sarah with his children, her gentle efficiency both a relief and a painful reminder of what they had lost. He kept his distance emotionally, throwing himself into the hard physical labor of the ranch during the day and collapsing into exhausted sleep at night. One evening in late June, after a particularly hot day, Matthew returned from the fields to find Sarah sitting on a blanket under the elm tree with both children. Elizabeth was laughing the first real laugh he had heard from her in months as Sarah taught her a clapping game. Thomas, now 2 months old, lay on his back, cooing at the leaves above. For a moment, Matthew stood frozen, struck by the tableau of happiness that seemed so out of place in his grief-stricken world. When Sarah looked up and smiled at him, something shifted in his chest, a feeling he immediately suppressed out of guilt and loyalty to Catherine. "Mr. Baines," Sarah called, waving him over, "Elizabeth has something to show you." Matthew approached cautiously, as if the happiness before him might shatter if he moved too quickly. "Papa, look!" Elizabeth held up a crude drawing of stick figures. "It's us, me and Tommy and you and Miss Sarah." Matthew knelt beside his daughter, studying the childish drawing where 4 figures stood in a line holding hands. "It's very nice, Lizzie," he said, his throat tight. "Miss Sarah says Mama can see it from heaven," Elizabeth continued matter-of-factly. "Can she, Papa?" Matthew glanced at Sarah, who looked suddenly concerned that she had overstepped. "Yes," he managed, "Mama can see it." That night, after Sarah had gone home and the children were asleep, Matthew sat alone on the porch, wrestling with his emotions. The drawing lay on his lap, the simple image of a family not the family he had planned, but a family nonetheless. The idea that Sarah had spoken to Elizabeth about Catherine, keeping her memory alive instead of trying to replace it, touched him deeply. July brought relentless heat and a drought that threatened the cattle. Matthew worked from dawn until dusk, moving the herd to what little water remained, repairing fences damaged by desperate wildlife seeking pasture. Sarah continued her daily visits, now bringing books to read to Elizabeth and showing a remarkable adaptability to ranch life. One evening, Matthew returned to find Sarah attempting to repair the water pump that had broken that morning. Her dress was stained with dirt, her hair falling from its usual neat braid as she struggled with the rusted mechanism. "Miss Kendrick," Matthew said, startled to find her doing such manual labor. "You don't need to do that." Sarah looked up, wiping sweat from her brow. "The children needed water, and I couldn't find your tools at first. I think I've almost got it, though." Matthew moved beside her, taking the wrench from her hands. Their fingers brushed, and he felt an unexpected jolt of awareness. "I appreciate you trying," he said, his voice rougher than intended, But this is men's work. Sarah straightened, her green eyes flashing. With all due respect, Mr. Baines, work is work. My father taught all his children, boys and girls, how to fix things. A broken pump doesn't care whether it's fixed by a man or a woman. Matthew stared at her, taken aback by her forthright response. Then, to his own surprise, he laughed, a rusty sound he barely recognized as his own. You're right. And you nearly had it. He gestured to the pump. Want to see how to finish the job? Together, they repaired the pump as the setting sun painted the desert landscape in gold and crimson. Matthew found himself impressed by Sarah's practical knowledge and willingness to learn. She wasn't afraid to get her hands dirty or to ask questions when she didn't understand something. How did you learn all this? He asked as they washed up afterward. About babies and cooking and now pumps? Sarah's smile turned wistful. Necessity. My mother died when I was 14, and my father was a traveling doctor. He taught us all he could when he was home, but he was gone more often than not. I had to become a mother to my siblings and keep our home running. Where are they now? Your family? My father passed 3 years ago. My brothers are both married with families of their own in Colorado. My youngest sister is finishing school back east. She dried her hands on her apron. I came west because I wanted something that was mine alone, something I chose rather than something thrust upon me by circumstance. Matthew studied her face, seeing for the first time the quiet strength behind her gentle demeanor. And instead, you found yourself caring for another family, not your own. Sarah met his gaze steadily. I chose this, Mr. Baines. There's a difference. As August approached, rumors of Apache unrest reached Deming. Several outlying farms had reported missing cattle and sightings of warriors near their properties. The territorial governor sent additional soldiers to the fort 20 miles north, and tension grew in town. Perhaps you should stay in town for a while, Matthew suggested one evening as Sarah prepared to leave. The trail can be dangerous, especially for a woman alone. Sarah packed the last of Elizabeth's freshly laundered dresses into a basket. The Apache have never bothered me. I've even taught some of their children who come to the settlement. Besides, the children need me here. We can manage, Matthew insisted, though the thought of navigating days without her help filled him with dread. I won't be responsible for putting you in danger. Sarah paused, studying his face. Are you asking me to stop coming, Mr. Baines? No, he admitted, but I'm asking you to be careful. Maybe Frank could escort you, or I could ride with you to town in the mornings. The concern in his voice surprised them both. Sarah nodded slowly. Very well. I'll accept an escort when it's convenient for you or Mr. Wilson. As she mounted her horse, Matthew stood watching until she disappeared down the trail. The thought of Sarah encountering danger on the lonely road between his ranch and town kept him awake that night, his mind conjuring terrible scenarios that left his heart racing. The next morning, Matthew rode into town with both children, Thomas secured against his chest in a sling Sarah had fashioned, Elizabeth riding in front of him on the saddle. He had business at the general store anyway, he reasoned, ignoring the knowing looks from townsfolk as he escorted Sarah back to the ranch that afternoon. This new routine continued for 2 weeks, with Matthew finding increasingly thin excuses to be in town each day around the time school ended. On a particularly hot afternoon, they stopped at the creek halfway between town and the ranch to rest the horses and let Elizabeth splash in the shallow water. Sarah sat on a fallen log, cradling Thomas, while Matthew kept a watchful eye on Elizabeth. The baby had grown plump and healthy under Sarah's care, his blue eyes so like Catherine's, bright and curious. He looks like her, Matthew said quietly, watching his son grasp Sarah's finger. Catherine would be grateful for all you've done for him. Sarah glanced up, surprised by the personal comment from a man who rarely spoke of his late wife. He has your chin, though, and your determination. He never gives up when he's trying to roll over. Matthew smiled faintly. Stubborn like his pa, Catherine would say. He hesitated, then continued. I've been meaning to thank you properly. Miss Kendrick, these past months, I couldn't have managed without you. Sarah, she said suddenly, after all this time, I think you might call me Sarah. Sarah, he repeated, the name feeling intimate on his tongue. Then I'm Matthew, not Mr. Baines. Their eyes met, and for a moment, something unspoken passed between them, an acknowledgement of the bond that had formed through shared responsibility and quiet moments of connection. Then Elizabeth called out excitedly about a frog she'd found, breaking the spell. They returned to the ranch as thunderclouds gathered on the horizon, promising the first real rain in months. Matthew helped Sarah down from her horse, his hands lingering at her waist a moment longer than necessary. She flushed slightly, but didn't pull away. That evening, as rain pounded against the roof, Sarah moved about the kitchen preparing supper, while Matthew built up the fire. Elizabeth sat on the floor, playing with wooden blocks, and Thomas slept peacefully in a cradle Matthew had crafted during the long nights after Catherine's death. The domesticity of the scene struck Matthew suddenly how natural it felt to have Sarah there, how the cabin had slowly transformed from a place of grief to something resembling a home again. Guilt immediately followed the thought, as if he were betraying Catherine's memory. "Is something wrong?" Sarah asked, noticing his troubled expression. "The stew is almost ready." Matthew shook his head. "Just thinking about the south pasture. The rain will help, but I'll need to move the herd soon." Sarah seemed to sense his half-truth but didn't press. Instead, she said, "I've been meaning to ask. School will be starting again properly in September. I'll need to be in town more consistently, but I don't want to leave you and the children without help." The thought of returning to managing alone sent a surge of panic through Matthew. Before he could respond, a loud knock came at the door, followed by Frank Wilson's urgent voice. "Matt, you in there?" Matthew opened the door to find his neighbor drenched and agitated. "Frank? What's wrong?" "Apache raided the Jensen place last night, took their cattle and burned the barn. Army's calling for volunteers to join a search party. They're gathering at first light." Matthew's stomach nodded. The Jensen's ranch was less than 10 miles away. "Anyone hurt?" "Jensen took an arrow in the shoulder, but he'll live. His wife and kids hid in the root cellar." Frank glanced past Matthew, noticing Sarah at the table. "Evening, Miss Kendrick." Sarah nodded, her face tight with concern. "Mr. Wilson." "Will you join us, Matt?" Frank asked. "Could use good trackers." Matthew hesitated, looking back at his children. "I have responsibilities here." "I'll stay," Sarah said immediately, "as long as needed." Frank raised his eyebrows, but wisely kept any thoughts to himself. "Think about it, Matt. Meeting at the fort at dawn. With a tip of his hat to Sarah, he disappeared back into the rain. After he'd gone, Matthew turned to Sarah. "You don't have to stay. It could be dangerous." "All the more reason for me to be here with the children," she replied firmly. "You should go, Matthew. The Jensens would do the same for you." That night, Sarah slept in Catherine's rocking chair while Matthew prepared his rifle and packed supplies. He moved quietly, watching her peaceful face in the firelight, her presence a comfort he'd come to depend on more than he wanted to admit. At dawn, he gently woke her. "I'm leaving now. Should be back in a few days, depending on how far we need to track." Sarah straightened, immediately alert. "Be careful, Matthew." On impulse, he reached out and squeezed her hand. "Take care of them. And yourself." The search party tracked the Apache war party for 3 days, following them deep into the mountains before losing their trail. 2 soldiers were wounded in a brief skirmish, and they recovered only half of the stolen cattle. Matthew returned home exhausted, his clothes dusty and his face sunburned, with a growing sense of unease about the increasing tensions. He approached his cabin late in the evening, surprised to see light still glowing from the windows. When he pushed open the door, the scene inside stopped him in his tracks. Sarah sat at the table sewing by lamplight, while both children slept peacefully. She had clearly been waiting up for him. "You're back," she said, rising quickly. "Are you hurt?" "No," he answered, suddenly aware of his filthy state. "Just tired. We couldn't catch them." Sarah bustled about, heating water for him to wash and setting out food. As Matthew cleaned up and ate the stew she'd kept warm, he told her about the fruitless chase and the Army captain's warnings about further raids. The captain suggested families might consider moving closer to town for a while, he concluded, But I can't leave the ranch. Sarah nodded thoughtfully. What about hiring help? Surely there are men in town looking for work who could help with the cattle while you stay closer to the house. Can't afford it, Matthew said shortly. Barely making ends meet as it is. Sarah hesitated, then said carefully, I have some savings. Not much, but enough to help hire someone temporarily. Matthew's pride flared instantly. I don't need charity. It's not charity, Sarah countered. It's an investment in the children's safety, in your safety. Her genuine concern cut through his defensiveness. Still, he shook his head. I appreciate the offer, but this is my responsibility. I'll figure something out. Sarah didn't argue further, but her worried expression remained as she prepared to leave. School starts formally next week. I won't be able to come out every day, but I could still help on weekends. The thought of seeing her only once a week left Matthew with an emptiness he wasn't prepared for. What about the children during the day? Elizabeth is too young for school, and Thomas. Bring them to town, Sarah suggested. Mrs. Wilson mentioned she could watch them during school hours. Or, she hesitated, then continued more boldly. You could consider moving them to town temporarily, just until the Apache situation settles. Leave the ranch unattended? Matthew shook his head firmly. This land is their inheritance. Everything I built with Catherine, I won't abandon it. Sarah's expression softened. She would want them safe, Matthew. Above all else. The mention of what Catherine would want coming from Sarah, who had never met his wife, should have angered him. Instead, her words pierced through his stubbornness because he knew they were true. Let me think on it, he conceded. The next morning, Matthew rode with Sarah back to town, both children in tow. The gossip was immediate widower Baines, spending so much time with the pretty schoolteacher raised eyebrows, especially among the church ladies who monitored the moral standing of Deming's residence with hawkish vigilance. Mrs. Peterson, the preacher's wife, approached them directly outside the general store. Mr. Baines, how good to see you in town, she said, her eyes darting between him and Sarah. Miss Kendrick has been so charitable helping with your little ones. The implication in her tone was clear. Matthew stiffened, but Sarah spoke first. Mrs. Peterson, did you know Mr. Baines is considering temporary arrangements in town for the children's safety with the recent Apache troubles? Perhaps you know of a suitable room to let? Mrs. Peterson's expression immediately shifted from suspicion to self-importance. Why, as a matter of fact, the Millers have a back room they've been looking to rent. How providential that you should ask. By that afternoon, Matthew had reluctantly arranged to rent the room behind the Millers' house 3 days a week, allowing him to work the ranch while keeping the children in town during the most dangerous times. It was a compromise that satisfied neither his pride nor his concerns fully, but it seemed the most practical solution. It's just temporary, Sarah assured him as he prepared to ride back to the ranch alone. Until things settle. Matthew nodded, watching as Elizabeth happily explored the Miller's garden. I'll be back tomorrow evening. Thank you for arranging this. Will you be safe out there alone? Sarah asked, her concern evident. I've handled worse, he replied, though the thought of returning to the empty cabin held little appeal. Take care of my little ones. As September progressed, the new arrangement settled into a routine. Matthew worked the ranch Monday through Wednesday, staying in town Wednesday through Friday nights. Weekends were spent as a family at the ranch, with Sarah joining them on Saturdays to help with household tasks that had accumulated during the week. The arrangement had an unexpected effect. Matthew found himself looking forward to the weekends, not just to see his children, but to spend time with Sarah. Their relationship had evolved from reluctant dependency to genuine friendship, with moments of something deeper neither was ready to acknowledge. One Saturday in late September, while Elizabeth napped and Thomas played on a blanket nearby, Matthew and Sarah sat on the porch shelling peas. The easy silence between them was comfortable until Sarah broke it with an unexpected question. Do you think you'll ever marry again, Matthew? His hands stilled, a half-shelled pea pod forgotten between his fingers. I haven't thought about it, he lied. Sarah kept her eyes on her task. The children would benefit from a mother's presence full time. They have you, he said without thinking, then hastily added, your help, I mean. I can't be their mother, Matthew, Sarah said softly, as much as I care for them. The unspoken words hung between them like a physical presence. Matthew wanted to reach across the space separating them, to acknowledge what had been growing between them for months, but guilt held him back. Catherine hasn't been gone a year, he finally said. It wouldn't be right. Sarah nodded, accepting his answer without argument. Of course. I shouldn't have spoken so directly. The moment passed, but something had shifted between them, an acknowledgement of possibilities that both exhilarated and terrified Matthew. That night, after Sarah had returned to town, Matthew stood at Catherine's grave under the elm tree. The moon cast long shadows across the simple wooden cross bearing her name. I don't know what to do, Kathy, he whispered to the night air. The children love her. I think I might, but it feels like betraying you. Only the night wind answered, rustling through the leaves above. October brought cooler weather and news that the Apache had moved further south after a decisive defeat by cavalry forces. The immediate danger seemed to have passed, and Matthew began considering bringing the children back to the ranch full-time. The dilemma was solved unexpectedly when a traveling photographer arrived in Deming, setting up his equipment in the town square to take portraits. Elizabeth, now almost 3, begged to have her picture taken with her brother. Please, Papa, Miss Sarah says we should have a memory. Unable to refuse her enthusiasm, Matthew agreed, though the cost of a photograph was an extravagance he could ill afford. When the photographer suggested a family portrait, Matthew hesitated, looking to Sarah, who stood nearby. You should be in it too, Miss Sarah, Elizabeth declared, grabbing her hand. Your family too. The photographer looked between them, clearly trying to determine their relationship. Your wife, sir? Before Matthew could correct him, Elizabeth answered proudly. No, silly. Mama's in heaven. Miss Sarah helps Papa take care of us. An awkward silence fell, broken by Sarah's gentle voice. Elizabeth, why don't you and Thomas have a special picture together? I'll help position you both. As she moved to arrange the children, Matthew caught her arm. Wait. He turned to the photographer. How much for 2 portraits, the children alone, and all 4 of us? The man quoted a price that made Matthew wince internally, but he nodded agreement. Sarah looked at him questioningly. Elizabeth is right, Matthew said quietly. You've been part of this family since the beginning. You should be in the picture. The resulting photograph, Matthew standing tall and serious, Sarah seated with Thomas on her lap, Elizabeth standing between them, captured something Matthew hadn't fully realized until he saw it preserved on paper. They looked like a family. Not the one he had planned, but a family nonetheless. That evening, as they walked back to the Millers with the children, Matthew made a decision. I'm bringing them home permanently next week. The danger's past and they belong at the ranch. Sarah nodded, her expression carefully neutral. Of course. They'll be happy to be home. I'd still like your help, Matthew continued, watching her face. If you're willing to continue visiting on weekends. I'd like that, Sarah replied softly. I'd miss them terribly otherwise. Just the children? Matthew asked, surprising himself with his boldness. Sarah stopped walking, her eyes meeting his directly. No, Matthew, not just the children. The honesty in her gaze both thrilled and frightened him. They stood there on the dusty street, the setting sun painting everything in gold, at a crossroads neither had expected to reach. I still love her, Matthew said finally, needing to speak the truth. I always will. I would never ask you not to, Sarah answered. Love doesn't diminish when it's shared, Matthew. It grows. He thought of Catherine then, her laughter, her strength, her fierce love for their children. Would she want him to remain alone, clinging to grief, or would she want him to find happiness again? I need time, he said finally. Sarah nodded, understanding in her eyes. I'm not going anywhere. The children's return to the ranch marked a new phase. Sarah still visited on weekends, but her role subtly shifted from caretaker to something less defined, yet more significant. Matthew found himself watching the clock on Saturdays, listening for the sound of her horse approaching, and feeling a warmth in his chest when she appeared on the trail. Elizabeth had taken to calling Sarah Miss Sarah Mine, a childish possessiveness that made both adults smile. Thomas, now crawling and beginning to pull himself up on furniture, would light up at the sight of her, reaching out with plump arms to be held. November brought preparations for winter and the upcoming holidays. One Saturday, Sarah arrived with fabric she'd ordered from back east. For Elizabeth's Christmas dress, she explained, showing Matthew the deep green material, and I thought we could make a special shirt for Thomas. We, Matthew asked, amused by her assumption that he would help with sewing. Sarah's eyes twinkled. You can cut the pattern at least. I've seen how precise you are with leatherwork. It struck Matthew then how well she knew him now, his skills, his habits, even the small gestures that signaled his moods. No one had observed him so carefully since Catherine. That evening, after the children were asleep, they sat by the fire working on the Christmas surprises. Matthew carefully cut the pattern pieces Sarah had drawn while she began stitching a small wooden horse he'd carved for Elizabeth. You have a talent for this, Sarah commented, watching his large hands work with surprising delicacy. Have you ever thought of selling your carvings in town? Mr. Jones at the general store might take some on consignment. Matthew considered the idea. Never thought of it, just something to keep my hands busy in the evenings. You should consider it. Extra income is always useful, especially with growing children. She hesitated, then added, Elizabeth mentioned wanting to learn piano when she saw one in the Hendersons' parlor. Education opportunities will cost money as they grow. Matthew looked up sharply. Did she? She never told me. Children often share different things with different people, Sarah said gently. It doesn't mean she's hiding anything from you. The comment reminded Matthew of all the ways Sarah complimented his parenting, seeing things he missed, understanding aspects of his children he struggled to grasp. The thought of facing their future needs alone suddenly seemed overwhelming. Sarah, he said abruptly, setting down his knife, I've been thinking about what you said, about marriage being good for the children. She kept her eyes on her stitching, though her fingers stilled momentarily. Yes? I think you were right. He took a deep breath. But I need to know something first. Is that the only reason you'd consider it? For the children? Sarah finally looked up, her expression serious. No, Matthew. You know it isn't. When did it change? He asked softly. When did helping with the children become something else? Sarah thought for a moment. Do you remember the day at the creek when Elizabeth found that frog? Thomas was sleeping, and you told me about the first cattle drive you and Catherine made together. You laughed when you described how she outsmarted that cattle buyer in Santa Fe. Matthew nodded, remembering. That's when I knew, Sarah continued, because you could speak of her with joy instead of just pain, because you were healing, and because when you laughed, I realized I'd do almost anything to hear that sound more often. Her honesty humbled him. Matthew reached across the table and took her hand. I'm not fully healed. Don't know if I ever will be. I don't want you to be, Sarah replied, squeezing his fingers. Your love for her shaped you into the man you are, the father your children adore. The rancher respected by his neighbors, the man I've come to care for deeply. Matthew held her gaze, finally allowing himself to acknowledge what had been growing in his heart. I'm not good with words like you are. But I think Catherine would have liked you, would have approved. It wasn't a declaration of love, but it was the most he could offer at that moment, permission to move forward without abandoning the past. Sarah seemed to understand, her smile gentle and patient. That's enough for now, she said softly. Christmas approached with a fresh snowfall that transformed the desert landscape. Matthew had been making regular trips to town, ostensibly for supplies, but increasingly to spend time with Sarah outside of the weekend routine. They'd take walks along the outskirts of town, sometimes with the children, sometimes alone when Mrs. Wilson volunteered to watch them. On these walks, Matthew gradually shared more about his life with Catherine, not just the tragedy of her death, but the joy of their years together. In turn, Sarah spoke of her dreams of having her own family someday, of her love of teaching, and of her childhood in Ohio before coming west. "Why did you never marry?" Matthew asked one crisp afternoon as they walked along the frozen creek. "A woman with your qualities must have had suitors." Sarah smiled wryly. "There were a few, but after years of raising my siblings, I wanted time to discover who I was before becoming someone's wife. Then, once I found my calling as a teacher, most men I met couldn't accept a wife with independent thoughts and her own income." "Their loss," Matthew said simply. The week before Christmas, Matthew rode into town alone, a small package secured inside his coat. He tied his horse outside the schoolhouse and waited patiently as Sarah dismissed her students for the holiday break, their excited voices filling the cold air as they rushed home. Sarah's face brightened when she saw him. "Matthew, I wasn't expecting you today." "Wanted to speak with you privately," he said, suddenly nervous. "Could we walk?" They strolled toward the church, its simple steeple decorated with evergreen boughs for the season. Matthew had rehearsed what he wanted to say, but now the carefully prepared words deserted him. "Is something wrong?" Sarah asked, concerned by his silence. "No," he assured her quickly, "just trying to find the right words." He took a deep breath, watching it form a cloud in the cold air. "The children and I have been talking about Christmas wishes." Sarah smiled. "Elizabeth has quite a list, I imagine." "She does," Matthew acknowledged, "but there's one thing they both want that I can't provide alone." He stopped walking and turned to face her. "They want you with us, not just on weekends or holidays, always." Sarah's eyes widened as Matthew reached inside his coat and withdrew a small box. "I'm not offering a perfect heart, Sarah. It's scarred and it's still healing. But what's whole belongs to you now, if you want it." He opened the box, revealing a simple gold band. "Will you marry me? Become my wife and a mother to my children?" Tears filled Sarah's eyes, but her smile was radiant. "Yes, Matthew. Yes to all of it." He slipped the ring onto her finger, then hesitantly bent to kiss her, their first kiss. Gentle and full of promise. When they parted, Matthew rested his forehead against hers. "I never expected to find love again," he confessed. "Didn't think I deserved it." "Love isn't about deserving," Sarah whispered. "It's about accepting when it's offered." They were married on Christmas Eve in the small Deming church, with Elizabeth as their flower girl and Thomas watching wide-eyed from Mrs. Wilson's lap. The ceremony was simple but joyful, the church filled with townsfolk who had witnessed their story unfold over the past 9 months. As Sarah spoke her vows in a clear, steady voice, Matthew felt Catherine's presence not as a ghost or a burden, but as a blessing. He knew then that love wasn't finite. It expanded to encompass all the important people in one's life, past and present. That night, after the children were asleep in their beds, Matthew and Sarah stood together on the porch of what was now their home. The stars glittered in the clear winter sky, and a sense of peace Matthew hadn't felt since before Catherine's death settled over him. "Thank you," he said simply, drawing Sarah close against the cold. "For what?" she asked, her head resting against his shoulder. "For saying those words that day. Let me help you raise your children now." "For having the courage I lacked." Sarah turned in his arms, her face illuminated by moonlight. "I think we both found courage in each other." As the new year of 1879 began, the Baines family settled into a rhythm that honored the past while embracing their future. Sarah's touch transformed the cabin into a warm home again, with books lining newly built shelves, colorful quilts brightening the beds, and the sounds of music and laughter filling rooms that had known only grief. Spring brought renewed life to the ranch, and the news that their family would grow again. When Sarah told Matthew she was expecting, his initial shock gave way to profound joy. "Are you happy?" Sarah asked as they sat together under the elm tree, Catherine's grave now covered with wildflowers Elizabeth had planted. "More than I thought possible," Matthew answered truthfully. "Sometimes I feel guilty for being this happy." Sarah took his hand and placed it over her still flat stomach. "She would want this for you, for all of us." In November 1879, almost exactly a year after Matthew had proposed, Sarah gave birth to a son they named James. Unlike the tragedy of Thomas's birth, James arrived safely after a relatively easy labor, with Matthew pacing outside just as nervously, but with a different outcome. When he entered the bedroom to find Sarah tired but radiant, holding their newborn son while Elizabeth and Thomas crowded onto the bed to meet their brother, Matthew felt his life had come full circle. "He looks like you," Sarah said, smiling up at her husband. "Same determined chin." Matthew sat carefully on the edge of the bed, gathering his family close. "Thank you," he whispered against Sarah's hair, "for everything." As James grew, so did the ranch's prosperity. Matthew's carved wooden toys, created initially for his own children, became sought-after items at the general store. Sarah continued teaching part-time, bringing innovative ideas to Deming School while raising their expanding family. In 1881, they welcomed a daughter they named Hope, completing their family of 6. The ranch house had been expanded by then, with Matthew and neighbors raising a new wing to accommodate their growing needs. On the 5th anniversary of Catherine's death, the entire family visited her grave together. Elizabeth, now 7, placed flowers she had carefully chosen. 5-year-old Thomas, though having no memory of his birth mother, stood solemnly beside his sister. James and Hope played quietly nearby, too young to understand the significance but respecting the family's mood. Matthew watched as Sarah knelt beside Elizabeth, answering a question about the woman none of them but Matthew had known. She spoke of Catherine with reverence and honesty, keeping her memory alive for the children without jealousy or resentment. That evening, as they sat on the expanded porch watching the sunset paint the desert in fiery hues, Matthew took Sarah's hand. "I was thinking today about how life takes unexpected turns," he said. "How the worst day of my life eventually led to finding you." Sarah squeezed his fingers. "Do you still miss her?" "Yes," Matthew answered honestly, "but differently now. The grief doesn't overwhelm me anymore." He looked at their intertwined hands. "I used to think loving you somehow diminished what I felt for her. Now I understand it honors her instead." "How so?" Sarah asked. "Because she taught me how to love, how to open my heart. Without that, I might never have recognized what we could have together." He raised her hand to his lips. "2 great loves in one lifetime. I'm a fortunate man." Sarah leaned her head against his shoulder, watching their children play in the yard. "We both are. Fortunate beyond measure." 10 years after Catherine's death, the Baines Ranch had become one of the most prosperous in the territory. Matthew and Sarah had established a small school on their property for their children and those of neighboring ranchers. Sarah taught reading and mathematics, while Matthew instructed the older boys in ranching skills and craftsmanship. Elizabeth, at 12, showed remarkable talent as a horsewoman and expressed interest in breeding the Appaloosa horses her father had recently acquired. Thomas, at 10, was quieter, with a gift for drawing and observation that reminded Matthew of Catherine. James, at 8, and Hope, at 6, completed their lively household with energy and imagination. One evening, after the children were asleep, Matthew found Sarah in Catherine's old rocking chair. Now Sarah's looking through a leather-bound journal. "What's that?" he asked, sitting beside her. Sarah showed him the pages filled with her neat handwriting. "I've been keeping stories about the children, about us, so they'll always know where they came from, how our family began." Matthew read the first entry, dated the day after Catherine's death. Sarah had recorded her impressions of the grieving widower and his children, her impulse to help, her uncertainty about being accepted. The honesty of her observations moved him deeply. "You saw me clearly even then," he said softly. Sarah smiled. "I saw a good man in terrible pain, a father determined to keep going for his children." "I was drowning," Matthew admitted. until you appeared on my porch and said those words I'll never forget. Let me help you raise your children now, Sarah quoted softly. The most forward thing I'd ever said to a man. The most important words anyone ever said to me, Matthew countered, pulling her gently from the chair into his arms. Words that saved us all. As they stood together in the home they had built from grief and hope, surrounded by the sleeping children who bound them together, Matthew and Sarah Baines embodied the resilience of the American West, the ability to forge beauty from hardship, to find love after loss, and to build a future stronger than the past that shaped it. Outside, under the vast New Mexico sky, the elm tree that marked Catherine's resting place stood tall and strong, its branches spreading protectively over the ranch where life, in all its complicated glory, continued to flourish.